Hi, my name is Chuko the Squirrel. I'm a North American squirrel that lives in a big oak tree in Connecticut. I have a little family as well. It consists of the mother squirrel and the 2 little baby squirrels. Now, my main job is to protect them and to also bring back enough nuts to feed them. So here's how it all started. We lived an hour away from where we live now, in a little pine tree. Oh, I loved her so. We weren't really very good at finding nuts back then. We'd only be able to find maybe a couple hundred nuts every month. So I worked on my nut hunting skills, and I got quite good at it. I started to find a few thousand nuts every month, instead of 100. But then what I found out was that a lot of the other squirrels in the forest, they weren't as good at finding nuts as I was. So what you had to do was every 3 months, you had to drop your nuts into a reservoir made for all of the other squirrels. And at first, I thought, oh, what a great idea. And so 1 out of every 3 nuts that I gathered, I would make sure I dropped it in the reservoir. The squirrels that did not contribute to the community nut bowl would be kicked out of their trees by all of the other angry squirrels. So I made sure that I dropped my nuts in the hole on time. And then I started to get creative. I started to learn how to plant some of these nuts and then grow trees. Now, growing these trees was great because then they would grow their own nuts. 1 nut planted could end up a tree that gives me 100 nuts. I started to plant trees all over the place. But by the time I had around 10 trees, I found that I couldn't do it all myself. There were other species in the forest, like these weird 4-legged pooping things. And then there were these big monsters that made a lot of noise, and they would just wipe my trees out. And then there were other trees that would block the sunlight so that my nuts wouldn't grow. But the solution was easy. I would simply share my nuts with other hungry squirrels, and they would help guard my trees. They would help clip the limbs on the trees that would block the sunlight. And they would also help me relocate trees in case those mean machines came around. So my trees grew bigger, and they started to yield millions and millions of nuts. There were so many nuts pouring down to the ground that a lot of them would even get stolen. But it was okay because all of the little squirrels that I worked with were happy. They were happy to guard the trees, and then therefore, all of these millions and millions of nuts that poured down to the ground kept everybody happy. So I was able to bring back many, many more nuts than most squirrels would be able to bring back to the nest. All of my little trees combined would yield millions and millions of nuts every year. But I had to make sure that all of the little squirrels that helped me with the trees were happy squirrels. And they were able to feed their families. I wasn't a greedy squirrel either. I'd only bring back a couple 100,000 nuts every year. If I brought any more back, I might be taking away from people who worked with me working on those trees. But remember, a couple 100,000 nuts a year is very, very good. Most squirrels only do 50,000 nuts or so. And remember, there's not too much incentive to bring home more than 300,000 nuts, because from 300,000 nuts, you're going to have to put 100,000 nuts in that hole. And geez, I don't want to have to owe someone 100,000 nuts. Most other little squirrel families, both mommy and daddy squirrel, had to hunt nuts all day. And they would usually do it near a grouping of giant sequoia trees that were a few 100 years old and would yield millions of nuts on their own. So when all was said and done, most other little squirrel families, both mommy and daddy combined, would only bring back 40,000 nuts every year. I felt pretty sorry for all the other little mommy and daddy squirrels in the forest. But I felt the time had come. The time had come for me and my little wifey squirrel to get a nice nest in a big oak tree. So we got ourselves a nice big nest in an oak tree near a lake in the forest. We started to hump all the time, and it was great because all of my trees were yielding nuts on autopilot, and all of my little squirrel friends would bring the nuts to me, so I didn't even need to go out and hunt nuts anymore. But I told my friends, don't bring me too many nuts because there's no room for them here. And besides, I got my new oak tree and I'm happy. Every morning I would wake up, look over to the left, and make sure that my trees were growing and yielding nuts. I did feel very sorry for all of the little squirrels fighting over the nuts on the ground. So I'd try to teach all of the little squirrels how to grow their own trees. Half of them were very thankful. The other half said, "Why are you selling me a dream?" So because we were humping so much, we found out that we were going to have a little baby squirrel. I used to share my nuts with this big bearded squirrel who would help me at the nest. One day, the bearded squirrel found little wifey squirrel in pain. We were very scared. She gave birth to our little baby. Unfortunately, we soon found out that our little baby squirrel would never be able to leave the nest and would never be able to walk. So a lot of the nuts that I brought back would have to go towards caring for the baby. Now I had another little baby squirrel that lived far, far away. His mommy wanted him to come and live in my nest because my nest was bigger. So now I had 2 little babies and a great little wifey squirrel. Soon after, my trees exploded with nuts. It was great. Occasionally, some of my little squirrel friends that would help me with the trees would steal nuts. So me and my other little squirrel friends would tell those squirrel friends to find nuts somewhere else. Ooh, they would get very mad, almost as mad as the squirrels who thought that I should be putting more nuts into the hole. Although, those angry squirrels, they only had to put 1 out of 10 nuts into that hole. Meanwhile, I had to put 1 out of 3 nuts into the hole. But I usually only had to share the nuts that I brought back to the tree, because all of the millions of nuts that came from my little orchard would be reinvested into the soil to grow more trees, or would be given to all the other little squirrels. And this is the way it had been done for years, and really worked. It was a good idea, and heck, for years to come. So I sold my best trees to a big fat squirrel. This big fat squirrel gave me 420,000 nuts for these best trees. I took 100,000 of the nuts and I brought them back to the nest, but I'd also taken 300,000 nuts earlier that year to the nest, and those nuts were gone. But have no worries, back to work I went, but I would have to grow all new trees. I would make a lot of noise, and the other squirrels would wonder what is wrong with me. I would make noises like, ah! And the other little squirrels around would wonder if I was sick or had rabies. All of us squirrels usually got around by vines. We would swing from vine to vine, and I had one of the nicest vines. In fact, I had to spend about 180,000 nuts to get this really nice vine to transport myself. I would fly my vine really fast, and one day I crashed my vine into an oak tree. It was not fun. So I decided to use a much shittier vine and not spend nuts on things that don't matter, and instead reinvest my nuts into more trees. All of us little squirrels, we would go down by the bog and we would eat psilocybin mushrooms. It was a really fun thing to do as a squirrel, but I decided nowadays, since I was turning over a new leaf, reinvesting all of my nuts back into my business, making it much more stronger, that I wanted to think clearer, and it worked. I was able to grow 1 million nuts in the next 6 months. The best part about it was that now that I was being smart, I was growing, and my business was growing, and everything was very healthy. And all of the little squirrels that lived with me in the forest were all my great little friends. Only I met these 2 squirrels. They called themselves Nut Network, and they would promise to water my trees with help from a whole bunch of little squirrels. And in return, I would give them nuts that they would give to their little squirrels. So I began to do that, and their little squirrels would come and water my trees. But about 3 months later, all of my trees died because they had been being watered with poison. So I planted all new trees, and this time I would go about it much different. Usually the nut yield from a tree occurs about 4 to 5 months after I plant it. But with this new breed of tree that I started to plant and grow, I started to see nuts bloom after 1 month. This was very exciting for Chuko the squirrel. I was, for the first time in my entire adult squirrel life, able to see such growth so fast. And so what did I learn during my time in this forest? That a clever squirrel with great ability can reinvent himself and overcome great challenges again and again. And I thank all my great little squirrel friends. And I wish you all a beautiful little squirrel life and an endless supply of nuts. And remember, if anyone ever gets you down, you can remember that you can drop your nuts on their face.